Shiki. One of the biggest inspirations to trance music, and one of the most influential artists in rhythm games who had been in the scene for almost 20 years. He was someone who had represented the earliest days of BMS, and whose works were well ahead of their time. Someone who, over the past 19 odd years, has had an incredibly deep history of work that, ironically, may have been the cause of his unprecedented demise. On July 18th, 2021, Void, another popular BMS artist, sent a tweet containing a formal statement that pronounced Shiki dead as of July of 2021. This came after a series of seemingly suspicious tweets claiming to be Shiki's older brother announced that Shiki had died on the 6th of July 2021. Void took it on himself to confirm this by reaching out to Shiki's family, and much to everyone's shock, the account holder was legitimate, and the news was confirmed to be the truth. Thousands of people in the community, players and artists alike, mourned his death, and processed the news in different ways. Some binge listened to his song in respect of his work, whereas others took a more proactive approach and created remixes and tributes to honor his music. Whatever was the case, even though Shiki is no longer with us, what he left behind, his music and his history as an artist, will forever stay. And just like everything else that's been done, this video was made to ensure that it would never be forgotten. This is the legacy of Shiki, and the tragic story he himself has revealed to us over the past 2 decades that led to his untimely death. To see where it all began for Shiki, let's go all the way back to the beginning, to a time before me and some of you guys watching were even born. 2002. The BMS scene was still in its infancy, and what started off as a bunch of poor quality rip-offs from other games slowly began to transition into a medium where artists could create their own original pieces. With early BMS review sites and events encouraging this, a wave of brand new composers became inspired to pick up the pen and begin writing their own music, hoping for the music to feature in rhythm games and maybe go beyond that. One of these people was Shiki. It's unknown what the extent of Shiki's musical background was prior to posting his music on the internet, but on the 24th of February 2002, Shiki published what's currently his earliest known work, Digitalic Rain, a very primitive sounding digital rock track that, according to him, he played the guitar live for and spent a lot of time producing. Although you can tell how old it is by the sound quality, the biggest characteristic is how progressive the song sounds. You can tell how much effort Shiki put into the melody, and that was something that generally hadn't been done before, at least when it came to this kind of music. Unfortunately, although Shiki posted it online, this wasn't his debut since he didn't actually promote his work to the BMS community. His actual debut was the song he released just the day after, a track that was in all honesty well ahead of its time. It can be said that this is an incredibly early version of artcore because of the heavy use of classical instruments combined with the nature of the drum breaks, which is quite surprising considering this is also around the time Onneka released Feliz, the song that many consider to be the birth of artcore. Had Silent Sky been of higher quality, and if Shiki had a following, it could have easily taken that title. But nonetheless, this was still a testament to the potential Shiki had as a composer, and it marked the beginning of his journey. Now, Shiki had released this song to a site called Club Stubborn, one of the very first BMS review sites that only accepted original works. In fact, it was because of that Club Stubborn was so popular. Other review sites, the most prominent one being Re-Rise, also accepted copied or stolen work, which were beginning to be cracked down hard by bandmany themselves. So this site would help with not only steering clear of that, but also forcing artists to adapt to a new style of producing music for rhythm games. Unfortunately, just several months after the release of Silent Sky, it had been announced that Club Stubborn would be suspending its activity. The reasons for this is unclear, but in order to celebrate the impact that Club Stubborn had on the BMS world, the curtain for one last showdown would be drawn. Club Stubborn, the final. This was widely different to the contest you're used to. Instead of giving impressions, the audience would simply have to vote for 4 songs anonymously for 4 separate categories: the best song quality, chart quality, background arts, and overall quality. This was the first BMS contest Shiki participated in, and for it, he won in the background arts category by 8 votes with a song he called Cold Breath. This is something he himself describes as a fast-paced 200 BPM song with a melancholy melody, as well as it being the first time he's ever made a background art for a BMS file. Even though music-wise he didn't get much votes, again compared to the rest of the competition, this track felt ahead of its time, and this is the start of when Shiki really started to double down on his signature trance style of music. Even though technically this was trance-core, which I assume is the faster version of trance, the release of this song gave him a lot more traction as a BMS artist, with many emailing Shiki praise for his outstanding work, and eventually this led to Shiki updating his website with a personal profile describing himself for his fans. In it, he confirms he was born on June 16th, 1980. had an insatiable love for fighting games and listened to many different kinds of music, with some of his favorites being German metal and visual music. He also did a Q&A dating all the way back to March of 2002, where he answered exactly 100 questions from fans of his work. A lot of the questions asked were generally uninteresting, but he revealed some of his favorite artists and BMS authors, with Cranky, Sasakura UK, Akito, among a few others getting a mention, as well as the first ever BMS he himself played, which fittingly was called Maharya Trance. Finally, in the second to last question, when asked, "What does BMS mean to you?" he responds with, "Just killing time." After creating a couple more BMS files, Shiki would end up on an almost 4-month hiatus until the 8th of January 2003. On this day, Shiki published what's perhaps one of his most legendary and well-known songs to date. Along with help from -45 for the background art, this was the day SEPIA was released. This was the first actual trance song that Shiki made, and this is what began the progression of Shiki's music to become primarily trance, characterized by an incredibly strong melody and a beautiful atmosphere. It's no surprise that this would very quickly end up as one of Shiki's most popular songs, and this is typically paired with Air, another non-contest song released on the Christmas Eve of that year. The impact that this song has had on rhythm games cannot simply be summed up into words, and this was head and shoulders above any previous work that Shiki had done. It shares the speed of Cold Breath, but has the same level of beauty as Sepia, to create what's the ultimate summary of Shiki's style. The background art was also made by a Korean, Ryu, which doesn't sound that deep these days, but remember, this was back when BMS was almost exclusively ran by the Japanese, so this was seen as a big thing. It was a sign that BMS was slowly making its way around the world, and this song, along with Sepia, were the kind of high quality songs that represented it. After making these two and putting a couple more contests under his belt, including one he actually ran himself called Liz vs OMT, perhaps it was fate that that very next year, the biggest BMS contest of today would make its entrance for the first time in history. Since events were largely individual, someone proposed that instead there should be a team event, where each team would have to work together to create the best songs they can. As a parody of the King of Fighters, this was called the BMS of Fighters, and it was to be ran by someone called Iru Mambo, the owner of the domain where most BMS event venues are held. The rules were simple. There were only to be 3 BMS artists on each team, and each artist would have to produce 1 song each. There can be additional people on the team for background arts and the like, but the BMS composers must do the bulk of the work for the song. People would then review each song using impressions, which are also given a score out of 100. The combined scores for impressions make a team's overall points, which they use to compete against each other. For the event, Shiki joined up with Akito and Wint, 2 other old school BMS legends, to create Team No-Po Corporation. And well, the event wasn't going to be easy. This competition had some of the top BMS creators of the time coming in, as well as some newer ones that had potential to take the crown, such as Yamajet, Taro Labo, and even Topazolite, and other founding members of the now popular hardcore Tanoshi. But this would prove to be no sweat for these 3, with Wint producing Red Rise, Akito producing some sort of sonata, and Shiki producing a Dutch trance song called Jupiter. Very similar to his other standout trance songs, with a much bigger focus on the atmospheric feeling of the song. If you had to pick a song to listen to while you flew around the surface of Jupiter, this would be a good choice, but it did feel like something was missing from this track. Perhaps it's because of the lesser focus on the melody, but it felt like there was not much of an impact compared to his previous works. It seems like the impressions from back then generally agree with that as well. Although some praised the atmosphere the song conveyed, many criticized the weak power of the instruments, the weak development, and many reported a general lack of excitement. A very common line of wording you see is that, compared to works like Sepia, they expected much more from Shiki, and impressions suffered as a result. Big time. For an artist with a name value like Shiki, you'd expect him to have an average impression score of around 85 or higher, but he only got an average of around 71. This would have been fatal to the team's performance were it not for the sheer volume of impressions he gathered, which still gave him enough to get 7,882 points, which was 7th out of 116 songs registered. His team also picked up his slack, getting 10k points each, and allowing the team to actually win the whole thing. As if Shiki wasn't popular enough in the BMS world already, now he was part of the first team to ever win in the BMS of Fighters. This was a huge deal for Shiki, and he should have been proud of his performance. But amongst all the criticism he received in that event, deep down, he knew he wasn't satisfied. On November 23rd, 2004, Shiki opened a blog on a website called Live Door, where he'd just make general posts about his life. They were very sporadic in frequency, but he'd mostly just make posts about traveling from home, playing video games, and anime. But every so often, he would make a post that was different to the others. These posts, upon reading, give a certain feeling of misery that I honestly can't describe. And the first of these series of posts was the post in the beginning of 2005, the 6th of January, simply titled, "This Year." Keep in mind he was on a break after the BMS of Fighters 2004. In fact, I believe he went on holiday, so this can be considered a direct result of that. In the post, he talks about only publishing 2 BMS in the past year, which compared to his previous work rate, wasn't much. And he admits that these 2 were uninspired, and according to him, they were tracks he didn't even feel like making. He also admits that by the end of the year, he was given the title, quote, "Failed Alpha Number 1" by everyone he met over that year alone. Because of his lack of songs and how uninspired the songs he did make were, the criticism he received went beyond impressions, to the point where he was even given a title to essentially take the mick. It's obviously okay to criticize artists you listen to, but considering that he felt bad enough to include this in the blog post, it was clearly starting to go a bit too far. At the very least, this motivated him to create even more BMS that he's actually satisfied with, and throughout the post, he talks about wanting to go back to the old Shiki. He even changed his schedule to be what it used to be when he first started, which was 1 BMS every 2 months. Reading this, I don't think saying he was motivated is the right phrasing. I think a more appropriate one would be he was pressured. Instead of Shiki following what he wanted to do, he ended up bending towards the will of his audience. And when musicians end up doing that, they tend to start repeating themselves because of how afraid they are about what the fans will think. Artists will become stuck in their old ways, and as a result, will never end up progressing. I want you to keep that firmly in mind as we continue onward. On July of that same year, after months of work, he announced that he was releasing a brand new album, or CD as he says, on his blog. Most of the songs would be ones that he'd made before, but remastered and extended, and he said he did his best to live up to his expectations. In that same post, however, he also talks about how hard it is, in reality, to even create extended versions of songs of his genre. He says of lyrics, it's far easier to create some sort of established development, and with things like game music or techno music, it's okay to not have development and loop was already been established. But for his tracks, he said he doesn't want to venture down that route of monotony, saying he wants to make actual songs rather than just music. The album, given the name Chris Tears, released on the 14th of August, and listening to the album myself, he definitely didn't do a bad job in this regard. Some did feel like they were padded out for the sake of it, but overall, it's a very high quality trance collection, and some of the tracks that he made that were completely new ended up becoming timeless classics. Case in point, Angelic Layer, another one of Shiki's most recognizable works. What a beautiful but also tragic sounding melody and atmosphere. Out of all the things I could think of, this gives me very similar vibes to Ascension to Heaven. I don't know whether to feel happy or sad for the both of them, and I guess in this case, that's almost fitting. Again, considering all this was made in 2005, it's clear that Shiki outdid himself for this album, and while working on this, he was also working on the song he would end up releasing for the BMS of Fighters 2005. To keep it brief, Shiki said since he had mainly focused on creating melancholy songs, he wanted to give a shot at creating something more happy and uplifting, so he went for a happy hardcore song. This isn't anything new though. In fact, one of the first songs he made was actually a happy hardcore track back in 2002, but with how much he's improved from then, it'd be exciting to see what he's capable of. He also showed a team banner in that same post, revealing 2 other artists, Snowdrop and Caspi Cruz, and later revealing Fitty for BGA. This was, coincidentally, called the Revenger Team, and Shiki will release the song later in September for the world to see, calling it A Beautiful Wings. The title could really not be more true. The track as a whole is just a beauty to listen to, especially when combined with the background art, which is an anime-inspired sequence telling the story of a girl that gained the power to fly when she found a stray bunny of some kind. Even though it's not the most stellar animation, it's enough to get the point across, and something about this composition feels incredibly nostalgic and almost tear-jerking as a result. This is definitely one of those works by Shiki that really went under the radar, but in the competition, this got 6 out of the 127 songs, a huge improvement over last time, but unfortunately his team didn't quite follow suit in terms of performance, leaving the team at 6th place. Obviously for Shiki standards, it's quite a drop, but hey, it was still an impressive performance. Fun fact, the stage of the city in this is modeled on the Hotere Gaike Higashi One in Osaka, which is where Shiki lived at the time. I assume Fitty is mainly talking about the design of the traffic lights here, which is pretty much identical, as you can see. By this point, Shiki has already established himself as a legendary BMS creator, and he became a face of the rhythm game music scene. Naturally, this would be a huge motivator to create more music, and it was, but unfortunately for Shiki, it was far too hard to balance creating music and his real life responsibilities. On November 28th, 2005, he submitted a post titled, "I want to become neat," and in it, he shared some of his frustrations and wanted to work on music, but not having the time because of work. Supposedly, he was hurried by an EST member, not sure what he's referring to here, to write a song for a new CD that was being released. And although he accepts that it's only natural that he's rushed at least a little bit, he also clearly is feeling frustrated about this, and his inability to produce a song in a short time frame due to exhaustion and zero time from his real life job, saying, quote, "But what should I do? I can't do it. I can't do it at all." It's funny how bad it is. He follows this up by talking about how he feels hesitant to put on a suit every morning to go to work, and also says, quote, "I'm sorry to say this, but there are many BMS authors and Dojin authors who are neats and freelancers. They don't pay taxes and live as parasites in society. Dreaming, finding a dream, chasing dreams. To be honest, I envy them a little." Basically, he's saying he would much rather become a freelancer with his music than continue to work in the corporate world. And according to him, if serving a company is being a good member of society, then he doesn't think he can be a good member of society anymore. It's unknown whether he actually follows through with any of this, but I'm sure we can all understand where he's coming from. 2006 then saw the release of the BMS for Angelic Layer, and yet another blog post, this time revealing a little more about Shiki's past before BMS. Unfortunately, it's not the prettiest picture. In this post in particular, Shiki talks about the responsibilities that school staff in Japan are failing to meet, and one of the things he thinks isn't being handled properly is bullying. From here it's revealed that as a kid, he was in fact bullied a lot, telling shocking stories about what would happen to him. Trigger warning, this stuff gets pretty graphic. In one case, according to him, his bullies would smash 5 or 6 glass bottles onto concrete and force Shiki to lay naked on top of the glass. Then, the translation isn't exactly clear on this one, but it seems like he's saying the bullies would then step on top of Shiki with bicycles. As his back was covered in blood from that, he was trying to retrieve his clothes to put back on, but he was told that if he did, the blood would clearly show through his clothes. So, they beat him and put duct tape all over his back to stop the bleeding. Keep in mind that this was while he was in elementary school, and it didn't end there. He reveals he would also be beaten when he got home by his mother. So at his age, he really had no safe place to turn to, and he, quote, spent most of his day thinking about how he was going to die. In the end, he was bullied until middle school, where he met X, and from there he dyed his hair, smoked cigarettes, and became a so-called guitar boy. Remember Shiki's first track, Digitalic Rain? How the guitar for that was played live? Suddenly, his choice of genre makes a lot more sense, but it's also an incredibly sad and shocking origin. It's not even like Shiki was targeted because he was weak either. In fact, according to him, he was targeted specifically because he was a strong guy who could do well in sports and studies, which made him be seen as an enemy. Reading this was a painful reminder to how cruel human beings can be, and it adds an extra layer to his already melancholy sounding music. Thankfully, those days were long past him, and as always over the next couple of years, he continued to focus on himself and his music. Over the course of 2006 and 2007, he produced 3 BMS, not insanely active obviously, but it was still good to see music coming from Shiki, and he was probably focusing on his real life responsibilities more than his music. 2008, however, was what was probably Shiki's best year in his history of being a composer. This was the year Shiki made a comeback in terms of activity, and reminded everyone what it meant to be a BMS legend. But first, he went on a bit of a detour. See, on April 13th, 2008, Shiki announced that he bought a version of Hatsune Miku. It's unknown what exactly brought him to make his decision, but he just wanted to mess around with it a bit and see where he could go. And here he released a song without any prior research or training. This wasn't an official release, but the file was called Miku_night_ignition.mp3. And shortly after this, Shiki made his official debut in the Vocaloid scene on Nico Nico on May 22nd, 2008, releasing Triangle Girl's Heart. Surprisingly, this ended up going semi-viral, sitting today at over 400,000 views. And from here, Shiki joined the Dojin circle Harmonia, where he'd continue to produce Vocaloid songs semi-actively until about 2012. On this same day, Shiki also released a brand new compilation of songs and uploaded it onto Nico Nico at the same time as Triangle Girl's Heart. This was called Rosen Trance, and supposedly it was trance for people who don't usually listen to trance. Suddenly, his inactivity over the years made so much more sense. He surprised everyone with 7 high-quality drops, the highlights of which include Rose Quartz, Lapis, and Pure Ruby. It turned out that these songs were actually from the 3rd album he released a few weeks prior, called Transfer Doll, and he probably posted on Nico for any additional promotion he could get. Lapis and Pure Ruby in particular ended up becoming very popular because of how good they sounded. In the notes for the compilation that he posted on his blog, he says that Lapis is his favorite song that he's ever produced. Now that happened, once the BMS of Fighters 2008 came around, he knew what he had to do. Returned to the scene after 3 years, he decided he wanted to make this one count, and that he wanted to place any burden on himself and himself alone. Therefore, he created a team with him as the lone composer, called I Don't Need Friends. And here, he created BMS for both Lapis and Pure Ruby, as well as an additional new J-Euro song called Chaser. The reason he signed up alone immediately becomes even clearer when you read a note he put for Lapis. In it, he says, quote, "As the leader of the Buff 2004 winning team, I worked hard on 3 works with the long-cherished wish of 4 years to repay the debt that dragged the team." Shiki has just told us directly that all this time, he has in fact felt guilty about his performance, even though that team from 2004 still managed to win. There was no debt that had to be repaid, but I guess the criticism really did get to his head, and he was made to think that. Regardless, even if there was, he repaid it in the best way possible, and his work allowed him to win the entire competition, becoming one of the few people in history to win a BMS of Fighters solo. After this, his reputation reached the highest we've seen, but even though he had a lot of momentum going for himself, his activity slowly started to dwindle over the next years. He was still active on Twitter, but he stopped posting on his blog, and his music activity was so infrequent that most assumed he stopped. To put it into perspective, between 2009 and 2021, Shiki produced 6 BMS charts. Shiki produced that exact same amount in 2002 alone. And sure, he did continue creating albums and CDs, as well as Vocaloid, but as said before, his Vocaloid activity stopped in 2012, and the last album he released was Kysteria in August of 2010. So, this begs the question, what was he up to in all this time? Well, perhaps the biggest thing that not many people seem to know is that Shiki actually formed his own band in 2010 called Glydia. This was a band based on visual rock and metal, and throughout the band's history, there have been quite a number of people that have contributed to the band, but the faces of the band were Shiki as the leader and guitarist, Erika as a vocalist until 2012, and Yuki, who took over after Erika left. There's not much info on Glydia since they were a pretty underground band, and the only footage of their live playing can be found on Shiki's Twitter. Here's what they look like. It's also known they released 8 albums and 5 singles total, so they definitely put in a lot of work. And this was what Shiki primarily focused on between 2010 and 2016, before Glydia abruptly ceased activity. It seems the main reason for this is because Yuki decided to leave, and since Shiki thought that he couldn't find a better vocalist than her, the band was disbanded. It was within this time frame, in September of 2015, that Shiki returned back to BMS after a 4-year hiatus, submitting Metatron for the BMS of Fighters Ultimate. And needless to say, it was a huge success. It gained 3rd place overall, and everyone welcomed Shiki back with open arms. From here, Shiki actually planned on resuming his BMS activity for the long run, and it would have been interesting to see the direction he would take with this. Remember what I said about being stuck in old ways? This hadn't left him yet, and it was starting to catch up to him in his criticisms, particularly in the BMS of Fighters 2020, where he released Fractal. This impression in particular summed up how a lot of his fans were beginning to feel about his work, and this was undeniably true. But Shiki, at this point, definitely had the motivation and drive to change this for the better, and even if he didn't change his style, we'd also be here to listen. The final work that Shiki released was Crystal Palace, which was a BMS that wasn't tied to any contests, on March the 13th, 2021. And the last we ever saw from Shiki was this tweet, talking about how he hadn't been on Twitter in a while and how he liked the post. And well, I'm sure you know what happened next. It's not confirmed how Shiki died, but many rumored that it's due to overwork. We forget that during all the things we mentioned, it's likely that Shiki had to balance this on top of a job of some sort, which is crazy to think about and makes me feel even more bad for Shiki. But like I said before, all the work he's done will forever be here to stay, and he will forever be remembered for the impact he's had on thousands of people, including me. Shiki, on behalf of everyone that's listened to your music, I hope you rest well. Thanks a lot for watching up to this point. I just wanted to quickly say that I really don't want to gain anything from this video, and feel like this should be treated as a tribute to Shiki rather than just another video on my channel. So if you're considering subscribing or following me, please check out my other videos before making your decision. Otherwise, feel free to leave a like and a comment to pay your respects to Shiki, and of course, be sure to support his music. As a matter of fact, I'm curious to hear what you guys' favorite song is from Shiki. Personally, I'm torn between Pure Ruby and Chariot. I had them both on repeat while making this, and I'm just curious to see what other people think. But anyways, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in a bit.